radio station.
Welcome to News Hour from the BBC World Service. Hello, I'm James Menendez. Coming up, Facebook unfriends Australia by abruptly blocking the sharing of news sites in response to a new law that would make the social media giant pay for local content.
It's a major change. It's not how the industry normally works. And not only did they catch everyone out, they caught their own technical expertise and algorithms out at the same time.
So could this now happen elsewhere? Also, NATO members consider whether to keep troops in Afghanistan despite a US pledge to leave by the end of April. And 7 minutes of terror, the perilous descent of a NASA rover as it prepares to land on Mars.
You barrel in at about 20,000 kilometres an hour into the upper Martian atmosphere, and you have to use initially the atmosphere and a heat shield to brake.
And then you still have to reach the ground. All of that and more coming up after the news.
Hello, I'm Debbie Russ with the BBC News. Life expectancy in the United States fell by a whole year during the first half of 2020, its greatest fall since World War II as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. Virginia Gidley-Kitchen reports.
The figures from the National Centre for Health Statistics show that black and Hispanic Americans bore the brunt of the pandemic. They were more likely than white people to work in frontline, low-wage jobs and to live in more crowded housing where the virus spreads fastest. The decline in the life expectancy of black Americans set back 20 years of gains. The gap with white Americans, which had been narrowing, shot up to 6 years. US life expectancy at birth had been steadily increasing since the mid-20th century. It now stands at nearly 78 years.
Facebook says it's restoring the pages of emergency services in Australia, which it had shut down as part of its action to block content in the country from all news providers. Facebook said its decision to prevent news sites from posting was a response to a new draft law in the Australian Senate that, if passed, would force tech companies to pay for news. The UN food agency WFP says alarming new data shows that more Syrians than ever are going hungry, and the UN's Commission of Inquiry on Syria has produced a report that is searingly critical of those who've kept the war going and of the rest of the world for failing to stop it. Imogen Folks reports from Geneva.
10 years ago, the UN Commission says the government of Syria unleashed overwhelming violence on its people to crush dissent. From there, opportunistic foreign finance and fighters have made the situation more complicated and even more violent. Today, more than half of Syria's people have fled their homes, displaced inside Syria or refugees in other countries. All parties to the conflict are likely to have committed war crimes and crimes against humanity.
Imogen Folks reporting. Dutch prosecutors have dropped their case against a father suspected of keeping his 9 children in isolation for 9 years and sexually abusing some of them. They said Gerrit Jan van Dorsten was too mentally ill to stand trial. He had also suffered a stroke, which left him unable to speak. Anna Holligan reports from The Hague.
Gerrit Jan van Dorsten's 4 eldest children wanted him to face justice for what they called the enormous damage he'd done to them. Police found him with his 5 youngest children in an isolated farmhouse in Ruinerwold, northeast of Amsterdam, after one of the children escaped and raised the alarm in October 2019. Prosecutors said he'd often withheld food and water, tied one child up by his hands and feet for punishment, and kept another in a doghouse for an entire summer.
Anna Holligan reporting from The Hague. You're listening to the World News from the BBC. A prominent Russian opposition activist who was prosecuted over an anti-Putin placard has been given a 4-year suspended prison sentence. A court in the southern city of Rostov-on-Don convicted Anastasia Shevchenko of supporting a banned pro-democracy group. German police have carried out dawn raids on suspected organised crime families in and around Berlin. Police said some 500 officers took part in operations at more than 20 addresses, making 2 arrests. They said it was part of an investigation into alleged drugs and weapons trafficking and tax offences. The French President, Emmanuel Macron, has said Europe and the United States should urgently allocate 5% of their coronavirus vaccine supplies to developing countries where vaccination campaigns have scarcely begun. In a Financial Times interview, he said some African nations were having to buy Western vaccines at over twice the price paid by the EU, or they were turning to vaccines with uncertain efficacy being offered by China and Russia. Zimbabwe's launched the rollout of its COVID-19 vaccine campaign following a donation from the Chinese government. Lawyers are threatening legal action against simultaneous trials to see how effective the Sinopharm vaccine is against the South African variant, which is now dominant in Zimbabwe. Shinkai Nyoka reports from Harare.
It's just 3 days since the COVID vaccine arrived and the rollout has already begun. At the official launch, the country's vice president was the first volunteer to take the vaccine. Those on the front line, including public health workers, police officers, soldiers and prison officials, will be next. The government says the rollout and trials are being conducted simultaneously. Human rights lawyers are threatening court action. They say trials need to be conducted before the rollout.
In the Australian Open tennis tournament, the defending champion Novak Djokovic is through to the final. He beat Russia's Aslan Karatsev. BBC News.
Hello and welcome to NewsHour from the BBC World Service. We're coming to you live from London. I'm James Menendez. And we're going to start today in Australia, where Facebook users had a rude awakening this morning. The firm abruptly blocked access to local news feeds in response to proposed legislation that would make tech giants pay for content reposted from other outlets. But as well as removing news, Facebook also shut down feeds from some health and emergency services, although it later said this was a mistake and they have recently been restored. Josh Frydenberg is Australia's finance minister.
Facebook was wrong. Facebook's actions were unnecessary. They were heavy-handed and they will damage its reputation here in Australia. Their decision to block Australians' access to government sites, be they about support through the pandemic, mental health, emergency services, the Bureau of Meteorology, were completely unrelated to the media code, which is yet to pass through the Senate.
And the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, said the government wouldn't be intimidated by Facebook's actions, despite being unfriended, as he put it. And this woman in Sydney was unhappy about the company's move.
I think Facebook banning news is terrible, actually. I do use Facebook. It seems to be a catch-all, and I can get all of my news in the one spot, so it will really impact me.
Well, I've been speaking to Chris Griffith, a senior tech writer at the Australian newspaper, part of Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, incidentally. Firstly, what is Facebook trying to do?
What Facebook was ostensibly trying to do was eliminate, if you like, the legitimate or the orthodox news sites, links to them from people's normal feeds, and, of course, their dedicated Facebook sites. But it caught, because of their algorithms being so poorly constructed, it caught an enormous number of sites in Australia. So there was a lot of outrage at this.
Was any warning given by Facebook that they were going to do this today?
No, look, that's one of the really interesting issues in this. We woke up in Australia to the news that Facebook was doing this, and they'd done it, all in an instant. In the tech industry, and a number of industries, but particularly in the tech industry, if you're a big provider and you're going to actually change a service or basically discontinue service, you give people, maybe months of notice so that they can remove their files. Now, this is just bad form, I think.
Do many people in Australia get their news via Facebook?
They certainly do. Mostly, it seems, the younger people and, interestingly, the elderly people, I guess, because it's a very simple way of getting news while they're using Facebook to talk with their family. So it is used, but it's a pretty bad habit, I guess, for all of us. Well, I think this has been realised in Australia that over the last 10 years we've stopped using, the orthodox way of typing in the URL, the web address, into the top of a browser to go to the original site. And for these people, they go via Facebook. So there's this dependency that we have on Facebook. And I think, firstly, the fact that Facebook did this. Secondly, that it affected such a big number of sites outside of news have got people starting to think.
I suppose the counter-argument, and obviously I don't speak for Facebook, but I imagine they would argue that actually the government is effectively holding them to ransom, saying, look, you know, we're going to pass this law, you've got to cough up and you've got no choice.
That's exactly what the government's doing. It's developed through the competition regulator here a code which requires news organisations and the big tech companies to negotiate payments, and if not, it goes to a compulsory arbitration system where an arbitrator, according to a set of rules, makes a definitive finding on how much payment there should be. Now, Google decided in the end to go with this system because their biggest fear is that under that arbitration system there'd be payments for any link in search, and they don't want search to be a place where people can make claims for payments because of the precedent. So instead they devised this news showcase feature, which is going to be an add-on news feature in Australia for news, and news organisations have paid for that, therefore avoiding that precedent. But yeah, it is a big stick to require the two sides to actually negotiate and come to an agreement. Now, Facebook have decided that it's just too difficult to do that. And while in Australia Facebook's income is not that huge compared to other parts of the world, they worry about the precedent. If in Australia they're paying out for news, there's 130 countries that Facebook is in that they'll be doing that there. And that, of course, would run into the billions of dollars.
Chris Griffith, senior tech writer at the Australian newspaper. Well, Facebook issued a statement today saying that the proposed law in Australia fundamentally misunderstands the relationship between our platform and publishers who use it to share news content. It's left us facing a stark choice: attempt to comply with a law that ignores the realities of this relationship, or stop allowing news content on our services in Australia. With a heavy heart, the statement ends, we are choosing the latter. So what are the implications for the rest of the world? Emily Taylor is the editor of the Journal of Cyber Policy of Chatham House, the London-based foreign affairs think tank. And Emily joins us on the line from Oxford in the UK. Welcome to the programme. How likely is it that this situation in Australia could be replicated elsewhere?
There's a genuine policy problem that is not just for Australia, but revenues for traditional news services have been dropping as the revenues of social media platforms have been rising. So newsroom employees in the United States have roughly halved in the last decade. Meanwhile, Facebook's revenues since 2013 have grown tenfold. And so there is a financing problem for news, which I think this law is trying to get to. But the main issue I think this highlights is the power of the big platforms and their ability to impose, if you like, a policy issue or to take on a policy issue a democratically elected government. And I think that this is an area where they have united everybody in Australia against them. So from a PR point of view, I think it's most unfortunate.
Yes, it's not a good look, is it? Facebook squaring off against a national government.
No, it's not. And it's not the first time, well, it's not the first time we've seen this from big tech, not Facebook, but if you look at the United Kingdom's experience with its COVID pandemic app last summer, it ended up with the government, again, wanting to go in one particular policy direction, and big tech, in this case Google and Apple, saying, no, you use our policy or decision, which is a certain type of data storage, or we won't allow you in our app store. And again, facing down a democratically elected government on a policy choice, it really gives very important questions about market power and legitimacy. Even if you agree that, say, the Australian law could have improvements, is this the way to demonstrate it? And doesn't it demonstrate in itself a much more worrying problem about democracy, which is the power of a single platform to deny people's access to news?
If it were to be replicated, this law or similar legislation elsewhere in the world, how much of a threat might that pose to Facebook's bottom line?
There's going to have to be some sort of adjustment when you have a situation like, if you combine the the GDP, if you like, of the biggest major platforms in the United States. They are bigger than most European countries. There is a problem with power and competition here, and that's going to have to be solved in some way or another. I think that what one hopes is that a holistic approach will be taken that also takes into account, fundamental rights like freedom of expression and access to information. But this situation very neatly demonstrates that where you have the power to wake up the situation where you can wake up one morning and your access to news is fundamentally different to how it was the night before because somebody made a decision in a different country. That's very worrying.
Thank you very much indeed. That was Emily Taylor, editor of the Journal of Cyber Policy. Well, let's turn to this big question now. Is there or has there ever been life on our planetary neighbour Mars? Later today, the American space agency NASA will try to land a big rover on the red planet's surface. It's the first NASA mission since the 1970s to make the search for life its main aim. It's also the start of a programme to bring Martian rocks back to Earth. But first, that landing, in itself a major undertaking. Professor Mark McCaughrean of the European Space Agency has been telling me more.
It's really difficult. You barrel in at about 20,000 kilometres an hour into the upper Martian atmosphere, and you have to use initially the atmosphere and a heat shield to brake down to about 2,000 kilometres per hour, and then you deploy parachutes. And the parachutes, they come out at supersonic speed, so they've got to be really robust, they don't get ripped. But the Martian atmosphere has only got about 1% of the density of Earth's atmosphere, so even a parachute won't get you down to the ground. The slowest you can get is about 300 kilometres an hour. So you have to jettison the parachute and then use retro thrusters, rockets, effectively, to slow you down all the way down to the ground. But what NASA's doing with Perseverance is going to land the rover on its wheels by hanging it, essentially, a rocket system which can hover. They lower it down, put it on its wheels, cut the cables, then fly and crash the other thing away. And that's all got to work automatically, no human intervention, in just 7 minutes. It's tricky. I've experienced it a couple of times, and it really is a nail-biting experience.
Assuming all goes well, what happens then?
Perseverance is landing in a very interesting place called Jezero Crater. And Jezero is a place where we know there was liquid water around 4 billion years ago. But there was also a river that flowed through that area. But there's no water there now. But if life had got started early on Mars, as it got started on the Earth 4 billion years ago, there may be evidence of life still locked in that debris, effectively, the material on the floor of the crater. And so Perseverance is going to be sampling that material and looking for signs of life in the past. But what's really exciting for us at the European Space Agency is it's also going to be drilling samples, putting them in tubes, leaving those tubes on the surface. And then in a joint ESA-NASA mission towards the end of this decade, we're going to go and pick those samples up and bring them back to Earth to really look at those samples in great detail.
Also, it's going to test some materials for possible future missions, including, possibly humans landing on Mars. How far away would that be?
It's going to be doing a couple of things relevant to human exploration. One is it's going to be trying to convert the CO2, the carbon dioxide, which is almost all of the atmosphere on Mars. The other thing it's going to be doing is testing spacesuit material and see how it stands up to radiation. Radiation's a very big deal on Mars, and it's the thing which, even more than the journey getting there, I think worries many of us about spending a lot of time on Mars. But then where are you going to live? It's partly a mix of the Sahara Desert, extremely dry, extremely cold, so a bit of Antarctica, but nothing to breathe and very little water around. You have to extract it from the CO2. And so probably if astronauts do go there, at least for long periods, they're going to have to live underground somewhere. It's not really a place that's anything like as attractive as people make out. I think to go and explore and have a look, I think we're talking 15 years probably still.
Really?
At least from the government agency side. I think we know how to do it, but there's lots of things we have to learn before we go there. And that's why we're going to the moon first, to practice some of those techniques that we need before we go to Mars.
Mark McCaughrean. Coming up a little later on the programme, the BBC investigates the live chat site Omegle.
In one 2-hour period during a BBC investigation, we were paired at random with 12 masturbating men, 8 naked males and 7 porn adverts. The site has no age verification, and we found dozens of under-18s, some children as young as 7 or 8.
That report coming up in about 20 minutes' time. Let's just recap our main headlines this hour from the newsroom. Life expectancy in the United States has suffered its greatest fall in decades, with black and Hispanic communities hit hardest. Facebook says it's restoring the pages of emergency services in Australia, which it shut down in a growing row over big tech's free use of content produced by news organisations. And new data has shown that more than 60% of Syria's population does not have access to enough food. This is James Menendez with NewsHour live from the BBC. There are no signs that the mass protests against the coup in Myanmar 2.5 weeks ago are diminishing. Wednesday saw the biggest rally so far against the military and its detention of the country's civilian leader Aung San Suu Kyi. And there were more demonstrations today. Police used water cannon to disperse the crowds in the biggest city, Yangon. But how long will the military tolerate these constant challenges to its authority? I've been talking to the Australian lawyer, Chris Sidotti. He helped lead the United Nations human rights investigations into Myanmar between 2017 and 2019, a response to the military's operation against Rohingya Muslims. First of all, I asked him, was he surprised by the coup?
I was, and that's because it's irrational. There is no reason whatsoever why the generals needed to stage a coup. They basically had political control of the country. They were getting rich because they're involved in so much business. They had a stranglehold over the constitution, and they had the international icon, Aung San Suu Kyi, running around the world defending them. Why on earth would they bother?
What's your best guess as to their motivation?
I can only come at one thing, and that is the intense personal hatred that the senior general has towards Aung San Suu Kyi.
Just explain a bit more about, you talk about their stranglehold on the system and indeed much of the economy. I mean, people have often talked about the democratic transition that's been taking place in Myanmar over the past few years, but I mean, it was never fully realised, was it?
Well, it was a faulty democracy in the first place. The transition was occurring under a constitution drawn up by the military, which gave them this stranglehold. The constitution could not be changed without the military's consent. They controlled the three key ministries of Defence, Home Affairs and Border Security. And in addition, they have these extensive economic holdings, these businesses that were bringing in a great deal of money and meant that the military, as well as getting rich through corruption, were able to operate outside of the ordinary budgetary processes of the parliament.
Do you think the senior general, the military leader Min Aung Hlaing, believed at all in that democratic transition?
Look, I think that he saw it as providing great benefit to the military. I never saw any evidence that he was committed to democracy as such.
And so can the outside world do anything to reverse what's happened?
Well, certainly we can take it far more seriously than we have in the past. The failure of the United Nations Security Council after the Rohingya persecution and expulsions of 2017 was scandalous. Private organisations like Facebook were doing far more than the Security Council to address the situation in Myanmar. So it would be good if the Security Council referred the situation comprehensively to the International Criminal Court. It would be good if the International Criminal Court then could hold the generals accountable. The simple fact is that until there is accountability, until the generals are called to account before an international judicial process, they're not going to change their ways. And we have to change. We have to take this more seriously. And in particular, we have to ensure accountability before the courts and an end to the business engagements with the military so that we cut off their money supply. They're the two things that are critical.
But could the threat of international justice backfire and make things worse and entrench the military in their belief that they need to have all power and hunker down, and anything that diminished their power might put them at risk of, as you say, that international justice?
I mean, make things worse? How could it possibly be worse? The situation in Myanmar is in crisis. The country under the military over the last 60 years has gone from being one of the richest countries in Asia to being one of the poorest countries in the world. There is a threat of military violence at the moment on the streets of all the major cities of Myanmar. The military is already so entrenched that they could not be more entrenched. And it's about time we stopped using this as a smokescreen. The situation is such that it cannot be worse, and the military have to be confronted. And that means confronted legally and confronted economically. I'm not talking about invasions or anything silly like that.
And when you talk about cutting off the money supply, you're talking about what? Sanctions, targeted sanctions?
Targeted sanctions against the military and military businesses, not comprehensive sanctions in the country. That was tried in the 90s and the early 2000s. It did not impoverish the military, it impoverished the country. It made extremely poor people even poorer. We need to be a lot smarter. We need to target the military and we need to break all connections with military businesses.
The Australian lawyer Chris Sidotti. Brazil is one of the countries worst affected by COVID-19. Nearly 250,000 people have died out of a total of 10 million confirmed infections. And within Brazil, the state of Sao Paulo has suffered the most. But this week, the small town of Serrana in the state has become the subject of a new study, the first in the world. It's trying to vaccinate every adult there to assess the impact on transmission rates. Katie Watson reports.
This week, Serrana announced to the world what's known as Project S. Last year, Butantan Research Institute, which has been developing the Coronavac vaccine with Chinese laboratory Sinovac, carried out a census showing that 10% of people in the town had had contact with the virus. It's thought that because it's a commuter town near bigger cities, infection rates were higher. So they're vaccinating all 30,000 adults here to see if by protecting an entire city, it'll bring down transmission rates. Ricardo Palacios has been leading the project.
What we want to know is when we can relax the other measures. This is the question the whole world wants to know. So how we can get the level of vaccination that we can take out the mask, that we will not be afraid that the people around us will get ill, and that way they get hospitalized or can die, and we can restart the life before pandemic.
Outside the schools where the vaccination's taking place, there are white crosses on the ground, about 2 metres apart, of course, making sure that the residents here still keep their distance as they wait in line for their vaccination.
For some, it couldn't come soon enough. Standing in the queue 6 hours before vaccination started, I met 70-year-old Marlene. I got here before 8, she tells me, to get the first spot in the queue. After 6 people in her family got the virus, she's keen to get protected. In a country hard hit by COVID-19, the trials attracted a great deal of interest. Isabella Migueli runs a real estate business. The phone's been ringing off the hook, with people trying to find underhand ways of getting the vaccine. And then, like magic, the phone rings again. A caller from Rio. His daughter's a nurse, he claims, and needs the vaccine.
The number of inquiries we received overnight quadrupled. Everyone was wanting to know how to get a house to be able to receive a vaccine. It is desperate.
But this town is also full of personal stories, of loss and devastation. For Carlos Pires, who was intubated in August, the trial is everything.
Eu sou muito ligado à família. Eu acho que o amor da minha família.
I am very close to my family. I think their love gave me the strength to recover. I wasn't going to. People who were in a much better way didn't. I have big hopes for the vaccine. I can't wait. I will be there in the queue. It's a dose that means life for us.
A gente fica comovida, né?
People here are clearly excited, but it's a small sample. Everyone here will get the vaccine soon. But in other parts of Brazil, cities like Rio have stopped vaccinating because they've run out of doses. And there's growing criticism that the federal government's not doing enough to keep people safe.
That was our South America correspondent Katie Watson reporting from Brazil. You're listening to News Hour. Do stay with us. Much more to come in the second half of the programme.
This is the BBC World Service with a story about a very complex relationship.
Growing up in Ireland, I knew little of the impact of the Irish on Britain. How did we shape the life of the larger island next door?
Influence of Irish saints on the west coast of Britain from the earliest times.
Irish descent. Oliver Cromwell.
Oscar Wilde could invert any sentence and make a new reality out of it.
The Irishman George Bernard Shaw was even recruited by the BBC to lecture the English on how to speak English.
Morrissey, the Gallagher brothers, Elvis Costello.
The Beatles, three of whom had Irish.